Episode 8 opens with Thaddius' journey to the Last Supper. Like the other disciples, he has a flashback to his old life after he sees a hammer. As he works on a new latrine as a stonemason, he discovers that the carpenter he normally works with has been replaced by a new worker, Jesus. The two end up eating lunch together, and Thaddius is intrigued by Jesus' time in Egypt, a wonderland for stonemasons like himself. Jesus points out that while a few of the Egyptian monuments may still be around in 1,000 years, most buildings, like the latrine they are building, will be completely forgotten. Revealing that he is a rabbi, he invites Thad to join him in establishing a kingdom not built by human hands, a fortress stronger than stone. At first, Thaddius thinks Jesus is talking about a literal building and is confused, seeing as how Jesus doesn't have land or money. When it becomes clear that he's not talking about literal construction, Thaddius questions whether he can do anything besides stonework and what Jesus can pay. Jesus insists that the kingdom they will build will have eternal value and will lead to a family bound together by a different kind of blood, with some of the most interesting, unfettered, funny, driven, brave, smart, strong, passionate, fiery, loyal, loving, imperfect people to ever walk the earth. We get flashes to each of the disciples. Jesus promises that he will see and do things he can't even imagine, being adored, hated, needed, lost, found, and loved, finding a home everywhere and nowhere, losing all his friends and even his own life, going to the ends of the earth, beginning the greatest movement has ever known, as people call them fools, liars, heretics, frauds, and saints. But the point is that he'll get a chance to say yes to the world's no, hoping against hope, believing against all belief, surrendering everything, and holding fast to end. And with this, Jesus invites Thaddius to follow him. Returning to the present, we see Thaddius being led by Mark into the upper room. The disciples are all standing around waiting for Jesus, questioning whether they are ready for what's ahead. Then Mark brings Jesus in, bringing us to where Episode 7's cold open left off. Mark in Episode 8 of the chosen Season 5 Last Supper, Part 3. After the cold open, we jump ahead as Mark listens from his first floor room to the disciples singing Psalm 118 at the end of the Last Supper. After the song is over, Jesus tells the disciples that it is time to leave, and Mark hears them all filing out of the upper room. Mark gets up, intent on following the disciples. Pilate, Attekus, and Claudia in Episode 8 of the chosen Season 5 Last Supper, Part 3. Having summoned Attekus, Pilate questions why he's been provoking Caphne's rabble to turn public opinion against Jesus, concerned that it may ruin a peaceful holiday. Attekus insists that the 3 criminals that they are planning on executing are not enough to make an impression, since everyone, Romans and Jews, will be happy to see the zealots executed. He goes on to explain that Caphne's men will be chaotic and artless in their anger. When Rome swoops in to keep the peace, it will make the empire look good. Pilate is not convinced, sensing that Jesus' unique presence is going to bring a reckoning upon the city. In response to Pilate's suspicion, Attekus explains that his loyalty lies not with Pilate or even with Emperor Tiberius, but only with Rome itself, and he urges Pilate to not let anyone distract him from Rome's interests this week. After Attekus departs, Claudia enters, looking quite exhausted after having not slept for days. She questions Pilate why he didn't reveal to Attekus the real reason for his disquiet, her portentous dreams about Jesus. While he did allude to how the chaos has touched on every area of his life, i.e. their marriage, he insists that he can't look weak and needs to win. Pilate urges her to try to sleep, but she insists that she cannot because of the terrible things she will see. When Pilate asks what she's been seeing, she ominously notes that he will soon see himself. The religious leaders in Episode 8 of the chosen Season 5 Last Supper, Part 3. When the Sanhedrin is gathered for a late-night meeting, Shimon objects that doing so goes against normal laws and procedures. When the others insist that Jesus poses a national emergency, Yosef tries to push back but is shouted down. Caiaphas insists that they are outnumbered and the deliberations are finished, only for Nicodemus to arrive and declare that they are not finished. Meanwhile, Judas arrives at Caiaphas' home and is greeted by Malchus, just barely returning within the deadline. Malchus sends a messenger to Caiaphas and then takes Judas to meet a troop of guards. Noting how they don't know what Jesus looks like, he asks Judas to find a way to point him out without escalating tension. Jesus and the disciples in episode 8 of the chosen season 5 Last Supper, part 3. As the disciples leave the upper room, Peter and James pick up the 2 swords that Simon Z brought, insisting that Z has no need for one, since he is a weapon in human form. Peter asks John if Jesus told him who the betrayer was, and John reveals that Jesus said it was the one he shared bread with, just before he gave bread to Judas. John 13 verses 25 to 27. But the 2 dismiss Jesus' words about Judas and Peter as an obscure metaphor, convinced that Judas wants to see the movement grow and not be stopped. Traveling by torch through the country, they arrive at a walled garden gate, where Jesus leaves most of the disciples, taking in only Peter, James, and John. Matthew 26 verses 36 to 37. Inside the garden, Peter, James, and John are alarmed when Jesus almost collapses. Jesus confides in John how sad he is, even to the point of death. This is very concerning to Peter, who wants to send for a doctor, but Jesus insists that he will entrust himself to the great physician. Reminding John once again to be near him, Jesus leaves the 3 disciples, instructing them to stay awake and keep watch while he prays. Matthew 26 verse 38. Going further into the garden, Jesus leans on a rock, recognizing that the time has come. As he begins praying, he struggles, insisting, "I don't think I can do this. You ask too much of me. I can't," but eventually moves on to pleading, "Make me stronger," as he weeps. His prayer is interrupted by the sound of wood being chopped. Nearby, an older man is cutting a branch and is soon joined by a younger man. We soon recognize them as Abraham and Isaac preparing wood for the sacrifice. When Isaac asks Abraham where the lamb is for their sacrifice, Abraham insists that God will provide the lamb. Genesis 22 verses 3 to 8. Jesus encourages Isaac not to worry, recalling how he and the Father spared him, since it was only a test of Abraham's faith. Moved by this vision, Jesus questions whether his father can let his cup pass, since all things are possible for him, and he was able to spare Isaac. Even so, he insists, "Not my will, but yours be done," Matthew 26 verse 39, and prays a shortened version of the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6 verses 9 to 10, declaring, "I trust you," to his Father. Returning to Peter, James, and John, Jesus finds them all sleeping. Sighing, he rebukes them for failing to watch for even an hour, and they apologize. Matthew 26 verse 40. He reminds them of how, in the Lord's Prayer, he taught them to pray, "Lead us not into temptation," Matthew 6 verse 13, and promised a helper, e.g. John 14 verses 15 to 16, and urges them to do so now, since the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak, Matthew 26 verse 41. Leaving them again, he returns to pray. Back at the rock, Jesus acknowledges that he has asked if there could be another way, but insists that if the cup cannot pass unless he drinks it, your will be done, Matthew 26 verse 42. As he does so, a strange fog creeps up around him. Entering the fog, he emerges in the valley of dry bones, meets the prophet Ezekiel, and asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" And Ezekiel replies, "O Lord God, only you know." Ezekiel 37 verses 2 to 3. The 2 embrace as Jesus weeps. Returning once more, Jesus finds Peter, James, and John asleep again. Matthew 26 verse 43. Suddenly, he sees them as young boys and is moved by compassion for them. Without waking them, he returns to continue praying. Inspecting the fruit of a tree, Genesis 3, Jesus returns to his rock and prays the same prayer as before, Matthew 26 verse 44, his hands shaking in fear. Suddenly, a hand touches his back to comfort him. Rising, he sees stepfather, Joseph, and the 2 embrace. Joseph assures Jesus that he will be waiting for him. Returning again, Jesus awakens Peter, James, and John again and announces that the hour has come for the Son of Man to be betrayed into the hands of sinners, since the betrayer is at hand. Matthew 26 verses 45 to 46. Although they are confused and alarmed, they follow him out to the garden gate and see the temple guard, religious leaders, and Caphne's mob approach with torches. Matthew 26 verse 47. Simon Z steps forward and urges Jesus to flee, but Jesus orders them to stop and stay back. Tension mounts as Malchus appears at the back of the troop, followed by Judas. Peter and the other disciples look on in shock and anger as Judas approaches, shamefaced. Hesitating, he is urged on by Malchus and approaches Jesus, whom he acknowledges as Rabbi. Jesus replies, "My friend, do what you came to do," and Judas kisses him. Matthew 26 verses 49 to 50. The Chosen Season 5 Episode 8 review. Episode 8 brings The Chosen Season 5 to a close with some brilliant touches. Performance. This episode rests largely on Jonathan Rumy's shoulders, and he does an excellent job. The reactions of the disciples to Judas are also quite well done. Jesus' invitation, Thaddius. Jesus' invitation to Thad is a beautiful and moving encapsulation of the joys and struggles of following Jesus. And Jonathan Rumy's delivery is spot on. Dismissing Jesus' warning. I like how Peter and John brush off Jesus' clear warning about Judas, in part because Peter isn't willing to take seriously the prediction about his own failure. Garden Temple. In the Gospels, it's clear that the Garden of Gethsemane is meant to make us think of the Garden of Eden, which was the original temple. The walls and gate of the Gethsemane in this episode evoke the idea of a temple, which led me to reflect on how the three layers of the tabernacle/temple, outer court, holy place, holy of holies, correspond to where Jesus leaves the disciples, where Jesus leaves Peter, James, and John, and where Jesus goes alone. I love when The Chosen is able to draw out insights like this that are latent in the biblical text. The three vision concept. I generally like the concept of the three visions, which I believe correspond to the need for a substitutionary sacrifice, resurrection, and incarnation/union with God. Out of the three, I found Joseph's appearance to be the most moving and effective. The Valley of Dry Bones was a pretty cool visual, and the Abraham-Isaac story was kind of no-brainer, especially how that story basically occurred at the same place. Child Peter, James, and John. Seeing Jesus look upon his three disciples as young boys was quite moving. It's a reminder of how God sees us in light of the whole of our lives. Much as parents often say, they'll always see their children as kids. It's probably my favorite moment of the episode. The reveal of Judas. The episode does a great job of letting tension build before finally unveiling Judas to the other disciples. The moment they see him is devastating. Iconography. The depiction of Jesus praying on a rock as moonlight broke through the clouds is clearly influenced by works in the Western artistic tradition like Heinrich Hoffmann's painting of Christ in Gethsemane. While it looks a little more stylized/artificial than The Chosen usually does, it felt appropriate for the moment. I did have a few issues with the episode. Attekus plot. I like the Attekus character, but continue to be frustrated by his overly convoluted and contrived role in events. It would be better if he and Pilate were more or less on the same page. Having him remain so elusive, even while in friendly company, adds unnecessary confusion. Also, a very similar double beat of Atticus Pilate having a tense conversation about what to do about Jesus and Pilate Claudia having a tense moment about her state just happened in episode 5. While things have gotten more tense, this felt like too much of a retread. Abraham and Isaac vision. The performances and setup of the Abraham vision felt a little hokey. Not quite up to the show's normal standards. Repetitiveness. While the three visions are a cool concept, the narrative that surrounds them feels a little repetitive. After Jesus struggles his way through to, "Not my will, but your will be done," the first time, it's hard to regain a sense of tension. It would have been nice to have gotten the sense that Jesus was dealing with different temptations or feelings. Although this could be done poorly, I wonder if the show could have drawn a connection to Jesus' 3 temptations by Satan Matthew 4 verses 1 to 11. This would have given the narrative a sense of progress or movement. Losing track of the disciples. While I like most of the time spent with Jesus, I wonder if we could have cut away even briefly to some of the other disciples. Not a whole storyline, but just a quick reminder of who Jesus is doing this for and of the anxiety that they must have been feeling during this whole time. In spite of these issues, I still felt Episode 8 was a fairly strong end for The Chosen Season 5, and it certainly left me eager for what's ahead in Season 6. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Humans are naturally drawn to things of strength and permanence. That desire leads us to build monuments, fortresses, and towers that reach to the heavens. However, as Jesus points out to Thaddius in the cold open, buildings made of wood and stone aren't as strong and permanent as they seem in the moment. Things built by human hands will ultimately fade away, and their builders will almost certainly be forgotten. The flesh is weak and impermanent and can build things that are weak and impermanent. But the kingdom Jesus invites his followers to participate is not built by human hands. Because it comes from God, it is far stronger than stone and has eternal value. Even so, this kingdom is made up of flesh and blood humans. Beautiful, interesting people, but people who are also quite imperfect. They hesitate, struggle, question, and doubt, just as Thaddius does in his conversation with Jesus. But Jesus isn't surprised by the weakness of our flesh. He knows better than to expect perfection in his disciples. What he does expect, though, is a willing spirit, that we say yes to the world's no and are willing to hope against hope and believe against all belief. If we are willing to trust him, Jesus is able to take weak fleshly beings like us and build us into something truly permanent and enduring. Atticus' loyalty to Mother Rome seems to be driven by this desire for things of strength and permanence. At the time, Rome had been around for hundreds of years, and it must have seemed like it would continue on forever. Atticus' commitment to Rome itself is far more logical than Pilate's petty commitment to himself, or even the commitment of some to a specific imperial figure or dynasty. Humans are, after all, quite weak and impermanent on their own. But from our own historical vantage point, we know that even Rome, with all its glory, ultimately faded. A stone not cut by human hands, a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, broke the kingdom of iron and clay into pieces. Daniel 2 verses 44 to 45. Even after the Last Supper, Jesus' disciples are still thinking that they need to build a kingdom through the strength of the flesh, with swords and human weapons like Simon Z. They continue to be in denial about what Jesus plans to do in order to build his kingdom. Entering into the garden, the three disciples are alarmed to see the weakness of Jesus' flesh as he nearly collapses on the ground and reveals that he is sorrowful to the point of death. They want to summon a doctor to help strengthen Jesus' flesh, but Jesus recognizes that the real battle ahead is spiritual and urges them to pray with him. The disciples underestimate the weakness of their own flesh and quickly succumb to the temptation of sleep on multiple occasions, instead of remaining steadfast in prayer. Of course, Jesus isn't surprised. Though the three may seem like strong men in the eyes of the world, in his eyes they are still weak little children, worthy of compassion. The time Jesus spends praying reveals the tension between his own weak flesh, which doesn't feel strong enough for the task ahead, and his willing spirit, which endures and keeps saying yes to his Father, that is, not my will, but yours be done. It's not a coincidence that as he leans on the Father spiritually through faith and prayer, he is literally leaning on a rock, a symbol of permanence that can hold up his own ailing body. Jesus' vision of the valley of dry bones is a reminder of the impermanence and weakness of flesh. Bones cannot live on their own. It is only by trusting God and receiving his Spirit that they can be built back into things of permanence. The confrontation at the end of the episode distills two visions of strength. On the one hand, we see the temple guards and Kaphne's mob, armed with the strength of the flesh. On the other hand is Jesus, already struggling to stand because of his weak flesh, and yet leaning fully on the strength of his Father and his Spirit. The power of presence and prayer. Though it's a well-known part of the story, it's easy to overlook the fact that Jesus brought his 3 closest friends to be with him in these final moments before his suffering and death. The Chosen has already established how Jesus finds strength and encouragement through the physical presence of his followers. See, for example, Season 4, Episode 4. It seems clear that he hoped to receive that same encouragement from Peter, James, and John. Unfortunately, due to their weakness, the 3 are not able to provide the comfort and encouragement he seeks. This is why Episode 8 has God send Ezekiel and Joseph to physically embrace and strengthen Jesus. The other well-known and easy to overlook dimension of the story is the fact that Jesus leans on his Father through prayer. He does not exercise strength independent of the Father. Rather, he needs to present himself before the Father in weakness in order to receive supernatural strength. The disciples, who Jesus encourages to pray but show no signs of doing so, will fail the tests ahead in part because they lack the supernatural strength that can come through prayer alone. How much more do all of us need to seek God when preparing to face our own trials and tribulations? Abba, because it's become so commonplace for Christians to call God their Father, it's easy for us to not appreciate how Jesus' prayers to God are indeed a conversation with his one and only Abba. Episode 8 tries to help us feel the significance of the father-son relationship between Jesus and God by highlighting 2 parallel father-son relationships. First, we see Abraham preparing to sacrifice his only son, Isaac, just as the father is preparing to sacrifice Jesus. This brief scene highlights the trust that Isaac had in Abraham, which in turn draws attention to the even greater trust Jesus has to have in God. Later, Jesus is then visited by the spirit of his adopted father, Joseph, who comforts and encourages him. Joseph is sent by Jesus' true Father in heaven, a tangible medium that the Father uses to communicate his own comfort and encouragement to the Son. Before Episode 5 begins, there's a brief warning about how the opening scene is very sensitive. As someone who's seen a lot, I kind of disregarded it. I'll be honest though, I was taken aback. My wife is pregnant, so I'm especially sensitive. At the start of the scene, set 2 weeks ago, a doctor awakes in the middle of the night to desperate pleading. A pregnant woman is bleeding in a way that evokes Veronica's bleeding, and she's placed on the table as if to give birth. Unfortunately, it turns out to be a stillbirth/miscarriage. It's hard to tell what stage the pregnancy is in. Only then is it revealed to us that the pregnant woman is Eden. Back in the present timeline, as Eden and Simon silently prepare his lunch for the day, the tension is palpable. Simon makes a classic husband blunder, feebly admitting that whatever it is, you're right and I'm sorry. Unlike Simon, we, the audience, understand the gravity of what she's dealing with. As Gaius and Simon work on the cistern, they banter about the differences in lifestyles of Jews and Gentiles. Simon complains that Gaius' advice didn't work, so Gaius has to explain to him that you have to know what you're apologizing for when you apologize. As they're talking, Gaius mentions how he has 2 children, his own child, and a servant child that his family has raised as their own. Simon rags on him a bit for having a slave, but it's clear that Gaius has a deep concern that he isn't ready to express. This is almost certainly set up for the story of Jesus healing the centurion's servant, as told in Matthew 8 verses 5 to 13. Later, while Jesus and the disciples eat breakfast, Eden is in the room and Jesus notices that she's clearly struggling. She is present when Jarius comes to beg for the life of his daughter, a moment that clearly triggers her. Nevertheless, she joins Jesus as he goes to heal Jarius' daughter. Simon and Gaius continue to banter, discussing the differences between Jewish and pagan worship and religion. Simon notes how their work reminds him of the prophecy of Jeremiah, in which God says they've rejected the source of living water for broken cisterns that cannot hold water. Jeremiah 2 verses 9 to 13. Gaius points out that if this situation is truly a fulfillment of that prophecy, the Jews of Capernaum, must have done something wrong. They see the crowd charging toward Jesus and go to investigate. Simon and Eden are present for the healing of Veronica, and Simon is present for the healing of Jarius' daughter. After the healing, Simon joins all the disciples as they frolic in the Sea of Galilee. Eden watches from the shore, doing her best to mask her pain in the midst of the celebration. In Zebedee's house, James and John continue to bicker over John's friendship with Thomas. We get a quick update on Thomas, who is still away on his mission to Rama's father. As they discuss Rama's good taste, Zebedee is prompted to announce to his sons that he's sold the boat. He explains that he inherited the fishing business from his father who died awaiting the Messiah. But unlike his father, he has met the Messiah. The fishing was meant to feed them, but now his sons have a better job. He's ready for a change in work too. He's going to buy an olive grove. Later, Zebedee, Judas, Tamar, and Mary Magdalene are viewing a field that they're considering purchasing. The trees are dying, but the seller explains it's because his father has grown ill and can't take care of them. They negotiate to buy the field and have the seller stay on for a time to teach them the business. Jarius and Yusuf. After the credits, we cut to Jarius discussing his daughter's condition with a doctor. The doctor tells him that there's nothing they can do. She will die soon. He kindly offers to arrange for professional mourners, a ritual required by Jewish custom. But Jarius refuses and goes out in search of help. Later, in the synagogue, Yusuf finds Jarius riffling through biblical texts on healing. Jarius begs Yusuf to take him to Jesus, but Yusuf doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know where Andrew lives, however, so they head there. Judas greets them when they arrive. Noting that they are Pharisees, he's cautious. Even when they explain the situation, Judas says he can't help them, but Simon might be able to, and so they head over to Simon's house. There they finally find Jesus. Jarius tells Jesus that he knows who he is, having read Yusuf's account, and falls on his knees, begging him for healing. Jesus, having explained that he is both a physical and spiritual healer, raises Jarius up and agrees to go with him, praising Jarius' faith. As they head to Jarius' house, a large crowd slows them down. After a healing encounter with Veronica, Jesus is able to convince the crowd to back off so they can press on to help Jarius' daughter. Unfortunately, as they're about to arrive, they hear professional mourners and see a Pharisee leader. The Pharisee explains that Jarius' daughter, Miriam, has died while he was away. Jarius is devastated, insisting to Jesus that he came as fast as he could. Over the objections of the Pharisee, Jesus insists on entering. He dismisses the professional mourners, who laugh at him, and the Pharisee, who accuses him of necromancy. Only Jarius, Simon Peter, James, and John are allowed to go up to the girls' room with him. When they arrive, Jarius' wife is furious that he wasn't there, but he pleads with her to trust him and trust Jesus. Jesus whispers, "Talitha Kumi, arise, my daughter," and she immediately awakes. Jesus explains to them all that they must not share what they have seen, even with the other disciples. It's not yet time for the news to get out that he has this type of power. He thanks Jarius for his faith and is leaving when the Pharisee confronts him. He accuses Jesus of touching a dead body and a bleeding woman, acts that would render him ritually unclean. He threatens to report Jesus to the Sanhedrin if he doesn't follow the rules for cleansing, but Jesus counters by telling him the girl isn't dead and the woman isn't bleeding. Veronica, Thaddius, and Nathanael. Nathanael and Thaddius are carrying water through a shortcut when they come across a trail of blood. They follow it and discover Veronica, who has passed out. When they offer to get her a doctor, she explains her problem. They offer to bring her to their rabbi, and she almost turns them, but ultimately she realizes who they're talking about and goes with them. She explains she doesn't need to waste his time. She could just touch his garment. They warn her against superstition, but she pushes back and explains that it might be to do that with others but not with him. In the course of their conversation, we learn that Veronica has been disowned by her father. Veronica, Thaddius, and Nathanael arrive in Capernaum in the midst of a massive traffic jam, generated by the news that Jesus is going to perform a healing. Thad and Nathanael ask her to remain on the edge of the crowd as they try to get Jesus, but they're unable to push through the crowd and tell her she'll just have to wait for another time. But Veronica is set on reaching Jesus, repeatedly telling herself that she just needs to touch his garment. At the same time, The man who shamed Veronica in episode 4 for her unclean condition notices her and asks Yusuf to have her removed. Threatened with the possibility of being removed, Veronica makes a desperate lunge and is able to touch the tassels on Jesus' cloak. Jesus immediately recognizes what's happened and quiets the crowd, demanding to know who touched him. Veronica, on the ground, admits that she touched his clothing because she knew if he touched her, he would become ritually unclean. She heard about his power from Simon Z's brother, Jesse. Jesus explains to Veronica that it wasn't his clothing that healed her, but her faith. When Yusuf objects that she's still ritually unclean because she hasn't gone through the waiting period, Jesus firmly insists that she is clean. He thanks Veronica for blessing him with her display of faith and entrusts her to his disciples. Later, we see Veronica cut off the rag she used to staunch her bleeding with a knife from the disciples. She goes to the Sea of Galilee and swims in it, basking in the joy of being clean. When Jesus arrives, she's concerned that she's made him unclean and that he's in trouble, but he tells her not to worry. He and the disciples are just going for a swim. Jesus and the disciples. Most of the Jesus storyline is covered above, but there is one significant scene between Jesus and the disciples that doesn't fit squarely into any of the other plot threads. As Jesus breaks his fast, i.e. has breakfast, Philip asks him why they don't fast like John's disciples and the Pharisees, concerned that the Pharisees might weaponize this against them. Jesus responds with the parable of the bridegroom and the parable of the wineskins, Matthew 9 verses 14 to 17, and explains that John taught fasting because it was a time of repentance, but he brings a time of salvation. The kingdom he brings doesn't fit into old frameworks or ways of doing things. Matthew and little Thomas observe how, in the parable of the bridegroom, Jesus hints at how he will be taken from them, and they express concern, but Jesus says they will have to discuss that at another time. For the most part, I found episode 5 to be a satisfying resolution to the plot threads set up in episode 4 and another strong installment for The Chosen Season 3. I do have a few issues that I'd like to point out, however. For the most part, I think the Eden plot went in a bold and interesting direction. That said, I have questions about the timeline. Episode 4 gave me the impression that the first missionary journey of the apostles was maybe a month. If that's the case, assuming Eden and Simon conceived during Season 3, Episode 1, she would be very early on in her pregnancy. On the other hand, during the opening scene, I got the impression that she was much farther along in her pregnancy. I could definitely be wrong about the opening scene. She might have been only a month or two into her pregnancy. But if she's meant to be farther along in her pregnancy, that raises a lot of questions. It would mean the missionary journey was longer than it seemed, which I can accept. But more importantly, it would mean Eden was showing, and yet the disciples who remained in Capernaum, e.g. Mary Magdalene, Tamar, Zebedee, didn't notice. Otherwise, I would have expected to see signs that they were concerned for Eden. It would be helpful if the show had found a way to communicate to us how long the disciples have been away in order to clear up the potential confusion here. I'm not against Thad and Nathaniel, but I think they work better as background characters. If the show let Eden, or maybe Mary, be the one who led Veronica to Jesus, I think that would have been more significant. I have a minor quibble with how the show interprets the parable of the wineskins. In many cases, Jesus offers 2 or 3 parables that have essentially the same meaning, e.g. Luke 15. And I think that's true of the parable of the bridegroom, parable of the garments, and the parable of the wineskins. The point of all 3 parables is certain responses are only appropriate for certain times. The show gives the parable of the wineskins a distinct meaning. The kingdom I am bringing will not fit into old containers or frameworks. I don't necessarily disagree with that idea, but I don't find it persuasive as an interpretation. I feel like Jarius should have been a little peeved/impatient when Veronica interrupted them on their way to heal his daughter. Putting myself in his shoes, I feel like he would have had more urgency. Having noted a few issues, there was a lot about the episode 1 like. Again, even though the episode was packed, the plot felt unified and it moved efficiently from story to story. Moreover, even though the episode resolved a few major storylines, it set up several more, ensuring that the season will flow well and feel unified. Like I said, I think the decision to have Eden miscarry was a bold choice. Laura Silva's portrayal was excellent, and the graphic nature of the scene was fitting, even though it was hard to watch. Miscarriage is an experience that doesn't get represented enough in popular media, given how common it is, and it adds a whole new layer of complexity to the Eden/Simon conflict, which was already interesting and relatable. Although the twist raises some questions for me, I think it makes sense for the most part and will make rewatching episode 4 an interesting experience for dedicated fans. I really like that the show didn't resolve Eden's struggle by the end of the episode. That's what I would have expected from The Chosen Season 1 or Season 2. Instead, by allowing us to sit with Eden in her pain and the complex emotions she must be feeling, watching the disciples celebrate after Veronica's healing. The last shot of her was so moving for me. It also felt like the show was being a bit self-aware. The complicated emotional experience of Eden as she watches the disciples celebrate in that final shot almost certainly resonates with some viewers who experience the exciting and joyful events of the show in a complex way due to their own unresolved issues. The show did a good job of creating subtle visual connections between the Eden, Veronica, and Miriam characters, analogous to the types of connections that the Bible creates through word choice and other literary devices. In general, I like the portrayal of Jarius and Veronica. It would have been easy to overact their parts, but I found their depiction to be believable and moving. Going into the scene with Zebedee, I was doubtful, but I found myself moved by his speech to James and John. I understand now why they left the scene in with him selling the boat, although I actually wonder if the moment would have been better as a surprise. The show is doing a good job of inching along minor plot threads, e.g. the conflict between John and James, Simon the zealous pursuer, and Gaius Kid. I continue to enjoy the Simon/Gaius dynamic. Their banter was interesting and felt like a realistic depiction of the difficulty that early Jews and Gentiles would have faced in building relationships. The claustrophobia and chaos of the crowd scene was very well done. The show created exactly the kind of mood it was aiming for while simultaneously juggling numerous character and plot beats. As the second half of a two-part arc, Episode 5 of The Chosen Season 3 picks up on many of the themes and ideas that were set up in Episode 4. I'll look at these first before turning to some of the themes that were unique to Episode 5. The joy and cost of serving Jesus. Episode 5 gives us several more snapshots that highlight the joy of serving Jesus. We see the joyful response of the disciples to Veronica's healing and the joyful response of Jarius, his wife, and the three apostles to the healing of his daughter. We also see Jesus' own joy in response to the faith of Veronica and Jarius. Most significantly, the episode lingers on the disciples joyfully celebrating in the Sea of Galilee on account of what they've seen Jesus do. The topic of joy also comes up several times in conversation. Early in the episode, Zebedee expresses his joy that James and John have found their true calling and that he too can pursue a new calling and service to Jesus. When the disciples ask Jesus why he doesn't ask them to fast regularly, he uses the parable of the bridegroom to explain how the coming of salvation in him is a time of joy and fasting is not a time for fasting and mourning. This parable sets us up for later on when Jesus dismisses the professional mourners who have come to grieve over Jarius' daughter, Miriam. The topic of celebration also comes up as Simon and Gaius work on the cistern. Although Gaius insists that Roman parties are better because of the sensuality, Simon insists that the Jews know how to celebrate, i.e., experience true joy in their own way. For all the joy we see and hear about, however, Episode 5 ends up feeling very heavy. By sandwiching the joyful events of the episode between such a painful opening scene and such a haunting final image, Episode 5 underlines the complex relationship between the joy and cost of serving Jesus. Churches, take note. While it's appropriate for us to celebrate when we see God work in a marvelous way, we need to remember that those who look out on our celebration may be carrying unseen sorrows. It may be painful for them to be present in the midst of our joy, because it reminds them of how God seems absent from their struggles and because they feel pressure to wear a mask. That's how I interpreted what was going on with Eden. The opening twist also adds a layer of complexity to the events of Episode 4. Simon's joyful experience of mission came primarily at the cost of his wife, who had to suffer her miscarriage alone, without his support. Moreover, while I believe Eden will ultimately emerge from her grief to taste joy once again, the cost that she has suffered can never be recovered. While we're discussing the cost of following Jesus, it's also worth observing that in episode 5 Jesus predicts his death for the first time through the parable of the bridegroom. Even though he tries to move on from the topic quickly, the disciples are clearly bothered by the implication of Jesus departing. I expect that they'll be even more concerned when he starts telling people they need to eat his body and drink his blood after the feeding of the 5,000. The cost and joy of seeking the truth. During episode 4, Jarius and Yusuf spent a lot of time debating the cost of seeking the truth about Jesus. In episode 5, Jarius is desperate, so there's very little time for debate. Moreover, his primary concern isn't truth, it's keeping his daughter alive. But just as there's a cost to seeking the truth, there's also a joyful reward. Because Jarius already sought the truth about Jesus using Yusuf's account and the scriptures, he knows who to turn to when his daughter is in a critical condition. Still, the appearance of the Pharisee at the end of the episode bodes ill. Though Jarius' pursuit of the truth has been beneficial so far, he is now publicly associated with Jesus and will suffer the cost when the Sanhedrin investigates what happened. Being clean/unclean. Episode 5 continues to explore the concept of ritual purity and cleanness primarily through Miriam, Jarius' daughter, and Veronica, the bleeding woman. The Pharisees approach the impurity of Miriam and Veronica with fearful self-protection. Even though Yusuf believes in Jesus' ability to perform miracles, when faced with the uncleanness of Veronica, he's more concerned about keeping the contamination contained than he is with bringing her to Jesus for healing. Likewise, when Jesus shows up at Jarius' home, the Pharisees' preoccupation with the potential contamination of touching the dead turns him into a barrier between the girl and salvation. By contrast, Jesus is totally unconcerned about being contaminated by uncleanness. When Yusuf and the other Pharisee tell Jesus he needs to cleanse himself because he's come in contact with ritual impurity, Jesus defiantly ignores their request. This isn't because he rejects what the Old Testament teaches about ritual impurity. He simply has a better grasp of his own authority, and that leads him to apply the law of Moses differently. The Pharisees have a category for physical healing, but they don't have a category for the type of holistic healing that Jesus brings. Healing that can wipe away not only physical disease, but also ritual and spiritual impurity. Whereas most people spread impurity and uncleanness, only Jesus has ability to spread purity and cleanness. Episode 4 also set up 2 other sources of uncleanness: Gentiles, specifically Gaius, and the cistern. In Episode 5, we gain a better understanding of why each of these is unclean. On the one hand, Gaius shares more about his beliefs and practices as an unclean pagan: wild parties, multiple gods, transactional sacrifices. On the other hand, Gaius has insight into the spiritual significance of the unclean cistern. His insight comes in response to Simon's reference to Jeremiah. Has a nation changed its gods, even though there are no gods? But my people have changed their glory for that which does not profit. Be appalled, O heavens, at this. Be shocked, be utterly desolate, declares the Lord. For my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed out cisterns for themselves, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Jeremiah 2 verses 11 to 13, ESV. As Gaius reflects on the prophecy, he concludes that the broken cistern a sign that the Jews have done something to anger God. What's interesting to note, but almost certainly not intended by Gaius, is that in Jeremiah's prophecy, the broken cisterns are a symbol of the idols that the Israelites turned to instead of remaining committed to Yahweh exclusively. I may be reading into this too much, but I wonder if the show implying that the Jews in Jesus' day have fallen into a form of idolatry, worshiping the works of their hands just like Gaius and the other unclean Gentiles do. C.F. Stephen's sermon in Acts 7, which implies that the Jewish leaders are treating the temple like an idol. We'll have to wait to see if The Chosen digs into the potential parallel in future episodes. Of course, the implication of all of this is that both the Jews and Gentiles need to turn from the works of their hands and embrace the cleansing source of living water that God has provided in Jesus. In the original biblical account of the healing of the bleeding woman, i.e. Veronica and Jarius' daughter, both women are described as daughters and are shown great compassion and care by Jesus. The implication is clear. Jesus looks on women in need with the compassion and concern of a loving father. Episode 5 translates this dynamic from the original account, but goes even further. We learn that Veronica has been disowned. When Jesus calls her his daughter, he's compassionately claiming a woman who's been rejected by the very man who should love her most, and in doing so, he gives her a new identity. Episode 5 also adds an additional daughter into the mix. Several visual cues encourage us to identify Eden with Miriam and Veronica. For example, there's visual parallel between Eden's position in the opening scene and Miriam's position in the scene that follows. There's also an obvious parallel between the bleeding of Eden and the bleeding of Veronica. Although Eden doesn't experience the active compassion of Jesus in the course of Episode 5 in the same way that Veronica and Miriam do, during the breakfast, Jesus clearly notices her pain. While it's painful to see Eden struggling at the end of the episode, we're encouraged to have hope that she will ultimately experience the same compassion that we saw Veronica and Miriam experience. Suspicion and self-protection. During Episode 5, we saw how the pressure of the world is leading some disciples to become overly suspicious and self-protective. Nathanael tells Thaddius about how Simon was meeting with Gaius and is clearly worried that Simon might sell them out. When Jarius asks Judas for help, Judas' suspicion makes him far too cautious and off-putting. Yosef's concern about Veronica's uncleanness also seems to fit into this pattern. On the other hand, the brief appearance of the zealot assassin reminds us why the disciples, and especially Simon Z, have a legitimate reason for suspicion. Episode 6 seems to function as a kind of pivot point for The Chosen Season 3. Although Episode 6 is juggling a lot of plot lines, many of these plots only got a scene or two because they are either paying off the tension that's been set up over the course of Season 3 or they're laying the groundwork for an upcoming plot line. I'll do my best to cover all the important threads of the episode below. Pilate and Attekus. Episode 6 opens with a dark and surreal vision in which we see the disciples sleeping. At first, they almost look dead, while Jesus prays fervently in the Garden of Gethsemane, e.g., Matthew 26 verses 36 to 46. Pilate's wife awakes from this dream, disturbed and agitated, a setup that anticipates how she will eventually plead with Pilate to let Jesus go because of the dreams she's been having. Matthew 27 verse 19. Looking outside of her villa, she discovers that several men are being crucified. When Pilate greets her, she warns him that if he's too harsh, he could foment another revolt. But Pilate brushes her concerns aside. Pilate has plans to meet with a friend, Attekus, which surprises his wife, who claims he doesn't have friends, just strategic acquaintances. Later in the episode, we see Attekus arrive at a pavilion that Pilate has pitched in an open field. He chides Pilate for announcing his position so arrogantly when opportunistic revolutionaries could come by and attack. After exchanging banter, Pilate asks Attekus to update him on his activities over the course of the past year. When Attekus notes that Quintus has been a bit of a problem, Pilate jokingly says he'll kill him, before acknowledging that he can't do that, because Quintus does a good job of maintaining revenue. Pilate is bothered, though, by Quintus' excessive use of force in putting down uprisings, since it means he himself has to be less forceful. When Attekus explains to Pilate the events that led him to Capernaum, and Pilate says he thinks Quintus is out of his depth, Pilate enjoys being in an unimportant, backwater territory during a time of relative peace, and even finds the Jews to be charming, except for the horrible high priest Caiaphas. He wants to keep Rome and the Jews satisfied, and for there to be peace. Having asked Attekus to return to Capernaum to keep tabs on Jesus, Pilate expresses his trust in Attekus' judgment and promises to listen to whatever intelligence and advice he offers. Simon Z and the anxious disciples. When we see crucified criminals in the opening scene of episode 6, viewers are reminded of the high risk for Jesus and his disciples at this stage in their ministry. In the very next scene, we see the disciples sharpening knives and spears, a sign that they also understand the risks and are anticipating them anxiously. When Matthew shows up and asks what they are doing, the other apostles explain that if a woman like Veronica was able to push through and touch Jesus without his consent, others could do so as well. Of course, this leads to a debate. Philip and Nathanael point out that if Veronica hadn't reached Jesus, then she wouldn't have been healed, and that they can't go around stabbing everyone who tries to touch him. There's also criticism of Matthew and Simon Peter for befriending a Roman like Gaius. Along the way, the disciples laugh at Matthew's lack of combat readiness, and Simon Peter offers to give him fighting lessons. All of this is set up for a moment involving Simon the Zealot. Nathanael has noticed that Simon is sharpening a sycamore dagger, like the one he got rid of when he began to follow Jesus. He tries to find out why Simon has acquired a new dagger instead of simply sharpening a more mundane blade like the rest. When Nathanael can't get anything out of him, he invites over little James. Simon Z confides to little James about how he is being pursued by zealots. James urges him to tell Jesus, but Simon insists that he wants to protect Jesus and not get him involved. A few scenes later, the anxiety of the disciples is triggered when a man comes from the Decapolis bearing a message for Philip and Andrew in the middle of the night. More on that below. And once again, when messengers from John the Baptist come, the disciples worry about whether they are spies. Simon the Zealot goes to the tent city to confront the zealots who are pursuing him. He quickly finds himself surrounded. Instead of fighting back, however, he drops to his knees and prays and explains to the zealots that he has abandoned the order in order to follow the Messiah, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Due to the presence of Gaius nearby, they hold off on attacking while scoffing at Simon, questioning why Rome is still in power if the Messiah has come. Simon explains that the Messiah has not come in the manner they expected. Nevertheless, Simon announces that he has given up his dagger and the way of violence, having witnessed the healing of his brother. When Jesus arrives back in town, he begins performing miracles in view of where Simon and the zealots are having their standoff. The chief zealot is clearly impressed. He witnessed Jesus' response to the disciples of John and Jesus' exchange with a local Pharisee. Jesus catches the zealot's eye as he urges people not to ignore the call to repentance and salvation that he is offering. Afterward, Simon Z asks the zealot if he understands now. The zealot says that he understands very little, but realizes that Simon Z has not proven faithless. Although some of the other assassins seem less convinced, the main zealot says he needs to find his own path and promises to go back to the order and share what he has seen. Gaius and Quintus. Early in Episode 6, Gaius arrives in Quintus' headquarters. After asking if Gaius has ever had a tattling younger brother, Quintus explains that Attekus is going to Pilate to tattle on him. That's bad news, because Quintus will need Pilate's endorsement if he's ever going to get promoted. Gaius assures Quintus that his record speaks for itself, but Quintus is not reassured and berates Gaius for failing to keep the tent city under control. The plan to tax the tent dwellers that Atticus proposed in Episode 2 has failed, because none of them have money, and the preacher, Jesus, is back causing more spectacle and chaos. When Gaius asks how he can make it right, Quintus half-jokingly tells him to kill Jesus, but then acknowledges that would create a revolt and more issues. Instead, he tells Gaius to eliminate the tent city by finding existing laws that he can enforce, e.g. building codes, health codes, in order to drive the people away. Gaius' response to Quintus is stoic and cold. Later we see Gaius on patrol in the tent city. After observing the plight of the people, however, instead of driving people out, Gaius begins helping the pilgrims. When Jesus begins performing miracles nearby, he is impressed yet again. However, when tensions between Jesus and the Pharisee begin to rise, he uses the limits that Quintus has imposed on gatherings of 25 or more to keep the conflict from escalating. He even pulls his sword on the Pharisee when he tries to keep hassling Jesus. the disciples of John, Jesus, and the crowds. The disciples of John the Baptist meet with Simon Peter, James, and John, who test them to make sure that they aren't spies looking to take Jesus down. Even after they've confirmed who they are, however, they all have to wait for Jesus to return to town before John's message can be delivered. When rumor of Jesus' return reaches them, they make their way through the crowd to where Jesus is performing miraculous healings, healing the blind, the mute, and the lame. Several other characters are in the crowd. The antagonistic Pharisee from episode 5, Gaius, the zealot, Yusuf, Jarius, and Barnaby, the man with a limp from season 1. Simon encourages John's disciples to share their message with Jesus. He recognizes them as among the disciples that heard John call him the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. John 1 verses 26 to 34. John's disciples are hesitant about sharing their message in such a public setting, but Simon Peter insists that it's the right time. John wants to know whether Jesus is indeed the one who is to come, i.e., the Messiah, or if they should look for another. Jesus isn't fazed by the question, but rather makes the messianic implication explicit. He explains to the crowd that John is understandably impatient. He tells them to tell John what they've seen, and to add the dead to the list of miracles, and to assure John that all will be well. The local Pharisee is indignant and denounces Jesus as demonic in front of the crowd. Jesus takes this moment as a chance to clarify that he is not rebuking John and affirms his baptism and zeal, in contrast to the Pharisees. He declares that John is the forerunner predicted in Isaiah 40:3-5 and Malachi 3:1. The Pharisee takes issue with this, given how John has denounced the Pharisees as vipers, Matthew 3 verse 7, and has been deemed demonic. Jesus insists on John's greatness, and yet declares that, as John would himself admit, the least in the kingdom is far greater. He goes on to compare the Pharisees to spoiled children who are unwilling to join in playing, regardless of whether it's a make-believe wedding or funeral. The Pharisees will reject anything, both John's solemnity and Jesus' joy. Although they claim to be wise, wisdom is demonstrated through action. Jesus implores those listening to not ignore the message of repentance and salvation and the evidence of God's kingdom in the lives they've seen changed. The local Pharisee is outraged and about to escalate the argument, but Jarius and Yusuf point out that they're in danger of breaking the ban on large gatherings. With Gaius' help, they shut down the scene before things can get too intense. Later, Jesus is walking with Simon Peter, Big James, and John. Simon points out that miracles are more fun with Pharisees around. James thinks they should get Jesus out of town because of the increasing heat. Their conversation is interrupted by Barnaby and Shula. When Barnaby saw Jesus heal a blind person, he realized he should go get Shula and see if Jesus would heal her too. Jesus asks Shula why she hasn't asked before. She admits that even though she believes in him, she's been afraid. After praising their faith and love, he heals her eyes and they all rejoice. Shula asks about Barnaby. Barnaby insists that he came to help her, not himself, and is content to walk her home. As they head out, however, Barnaby realizes that his leg is healed and runs back to thank Jesus. They then head home, much faster than usual. Simon notes that even without a Pharisee around, this miracle was just as fun. Andrew, Philip, and Leander. In the middle of the night, while the disciples are sleeping in Simon Peter's home, a young man uses a knife to enter through a window. The noise of his entry wakes all of the apostles, and they demand to know who he is. His name is Leander, and he was among those who listened to Andrew and Philip preaching during their missionary journey. Although Andrew and Philip followed Jesus' instructions about preaching only to the Jews, there are Greeks and other non-Jews who heard the message and have turned away from the Olympian gods and believed in Jesus. This has led to an uproar in the region of the Decapolis, with brother turning against brother. Moreover, the teaching of Andrew and Philip was incomplete, and those who have believed need to learn more. Leander begs them to return to finish what they started. All of this is a setup for John 12 verses 20 to 26, in which Greeks visiting Jerusalem that want to meet Jesus come specifically to Andrew and Philip. Mary, Tamar, Zebedee, and Judas. Mary is busy writing Rama a letter, asking for her advice about local farmers, when Tamar comes by and spits out an olive, commenting on how disgusting it is. Tamar notices that Mary is annoyed at her and asks what's going on. Mary is annoyed at how rude Tamar, a woman, was to an elder man, Zebedee. When Tamar argues that their work with the olives is their contribution to the ministry and is important, Mary points out that they have more to contribute than work, i.e., a good attitude. At this point, the conversation gets really deep. Mary expresses her exasperation at how she had to come to Jesus while drunk and demon-possessed, whereas Tamar got to push her way into the group with little suffering and was praised for her faith. She wishes that Tamar was more humble and explains how she herself constantly feels like she can never be enough. In response, Tamar insists that Mary is amazing and asks her why she can't see that. Mary doesn't think they're supposed to and chides Tamar for her lack of curiosity and her sense of entitlement and her boldness. Tamar expresses grief for Mary's shame and notes that she doesn't need to hold on to it, since she's received Jesus' forgiveness. Now it's Tamar's turn to open up. She explains how, even though she's not a Jew, she's known her share of suffering. Her country is war-torn because of tribal violence. During her most recent visit, she discovered that her family, along with the rest of her village, had been wiped out by a rival tribe. She found her necklace on the body of her mother. It still has her mother's blood on it, the only thing she has left. That's why, throughout Season 3, she's been so frustrated at how Mary keeps telling her to sell it. Mary is grieved. Having lost her father, she wishes that she still had a piece of him to hold on to. She admits that she's been judging Tamar's strength, boldness, against her own weakness, shame, self-loathing, and asks for forgiveness. The two embrace and figure out a plan to improve the olive grove. Later, Zebedee meets with Mary and Tamar after they visited a nearby farmer. They figured out what they need to do in order to improve the soil quality of the olive grove. They need to buy sulfur, though. Mary goes up to the money box, putting down revolts forcefully, or at least contemplate doing so, e.g., Quintus killed Jesus of Nazareth comment. By contrast, Gaius' arc over Season 3 has led him to befriend Jews and become less suspicious of them. Instead of taking Quintus' cue and engaging in forceful suppression of the tent city, he compassionately helps the tent dwellers. Listening and compassion. In Episode 6, characters at their worst are consumed with suspicion, anxiety, and self-protection. Characters at their best, on the other hand, are willing to listen to see the sorrows of others and are moved by compassion and empathy. This contrast between self-protective characters and compassionate characters is established in the very first scene. Pilate's wife sees the pain of Jesus via vision and the suffering of the crucified criminals and has compassion, whereas Pilate is only concerned about the political calculus of protecting his own position. Again, in the following scene, we see a contrast between those who are focused on the security risk posed by Veronica's actions in Episode 5, and Philip, who seems to have compassion for her plight. In the same scene, Nathaniel seems to recognize that Simon Z will open up more easily to little James because of his reputation for listening and being compassionate. Of course, the scene between Mary Magdalene and Tamar and the scene between Simon Peter and Eden highlight the importance of compassion and listening most clearly. What's interesting is that we don't a perfectly compassionate listener in either scene. Mary and Tamar struggle to hear each other out, and so do Simon and Eden. Each character is deeply wounded, and that makes it difficult for them to exercise compassion and listening toward each other. The drama of these scenes comes in seeing each pair stumble imperfectly through the process of listening, taking one step and two steps back, before finally arriving at a moment of mutual compassion and understanding. If there is a paragon of compassion in Episode 6, other than Jesus, it's Barnaby. Many people in his position would struggle to have compassion on others because they would be too concerned with their own suffering. But Barnaby, on the other hand, takes no account of his own wound because he's focused so exclusively on the wound of his blind friend, Shula. This is what makes it so satisfying when Jesus chooses to heal him as well. Vision/blindness. The topic of vision and blindness come up multiple times throughout episode 6. Sometimes literal vision/blindness is in view. The disciples reference how John and Thomas healed a blind person. Simon Peter tells Matthew he can use his pen to poke someone in the eye. We get numerous close-up shots of people watching Jesus. Jesus heals a blind boy's eyes. Jesus tells the messengers of John the Baptist to tell him how the blind are healed. Jesus asks to see Shula's face before he heals her. Jesus heals Shula's eyes. Jesus asks Shula to look at him after she's been healed. Vision/blindness also comes up as a metaphor on several occasions. Playing off of how John and Thomas healed a blind man, the apostles jokingly ask if Matthew needs to be healed when he doesn't understand why they're sharpening weapons. In describing his difficulty navigating life, Pilate tells Attekus, "I can't see 10 cubits in front of my face most days." When one of the other assassins threatens Simon Z, even after they've watched Jesus, the main zealot says, "Are you blind?" This Simon Z is not a traitor. In addition to these moments where vision/blindness are explicitly invoked, there are several moments in which characters have their eyes opened in a spiritual or metaphorical sense. Pilate's wife has a vision of the future. Mary Magdalene and Tamar see each other and themselves more clearly. Andrew and Philip see the consequences of their preaching in the Decapolis. Simon Peter sees what's been going on with Eden, although he seems to feel blind with regard to God's purpose, asking, why? Gaius sees what he has to do in the tent city. So what constitutes seeing versus being blind versus receiving healed sight? Being blind seems to correlate with suspicion, zealots, Pharisees, the apostles, or self-focus/arrogance, Simon Peter, Mary Magdalene/Tamar. Receiving sight seems tied to listening/compassion, again, Mary and Tamar, Gaius. I expect The Chosen will continue to explore these metaphors and ideas in greater depth as we continue on, especially given how often the Gospels employ the vision/blindness/healing metaphor, e.g., Mark 8 verses 22 to 38, John 9. The empire of peace versus the disruptive kingdom. It's tempting for modern Christians to cast the Roman Empire as completely evil and oppressive overlords. What makes Pilate such an intriguing figure in episode 6 is that he seems to be genuinely interested in promoting peace and the common good. When he waxes poetic to Atticus about how much he enjoys Judea and its people and how he just wants to help them sate Rome, I don't think he's being disingenuous. Like many Roman leader, I'm sure he really does have noble intentions, and I'm sure he's also accomplished actual good for those that he is ruling. By contrast, episode 6 highlights the disruption and chaos that's been created by the Jesus movement. Leander tells the apostles that the whole Decapolis is on fire because of how Gentiles are abandoning the pagan temples or turning to the gospel. We're told that it's brother against brother, a line that's reminiscent of Jesus' famous declaration. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies will be those of his own household. Matthew 10 verses 34 to 36, ESV. On a superficial level then, Rome seems to be the guardian of peace, i.e., the Pax Romana, while Jesus' kingdom appears to be a force of chaos and conflict. And yet, on further inspection, we see that the Roman peace is built on the violent suppression of potential enemies, while the kingdom of Jesus spreads as a result of disciples like Simon Z, who refuse to protect themselves and instead self-sacrificially confront their enemies and offer compassion. I've been reflecting on the very obvious snake armlet that Pilate puts on at the start of episode 6. Given how The Chosen portrays Pilate as quite charismatic and even likable, the armlet is an obvious reminder to viewers that he is ultimately a snake. Like the snake we saw in the vision of Gethsemane, he is on course to bite Jesus. But I think there's a deeper significance. In Genesis 3, the snake that deceives Adam and Eve entices them to do evil, disobeying God's command, by offering a good outcome, the ability to judge good and evil. In many ways, that is what Rome and Babylon and all the great kingdoms of this world do as well. They entice humanity to do evil, violently suppressing enemies, demanding worship by offering good outcomes, order, peace, and economic flourishing. By contrast, the kingdom of God is committed to the right way, compassion and love for enemies, offering forgiveness, even though there can be undesirable short-term outcomes. I'll be curious to see how much The Chosen explores these dynamics and the contrast between the peace the Pilate enforces and the chaos Jesus causes.